Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are, and welcome here today. We'll begin and continue to begin again as more people join and as this webinar series continues. I'm Lynn Murphy, and this is my dear co-author and co-conspirator, Alnoor Ladha. And together, we've been co-guiding something called the Transition Resource Circle. And so we just want to welcome you here today to our first of this 5-part webinar series where we're going to explore Post Capitalist Philanthropy and the subtitle of Healing Wealth in Time of Collapse. And we recognize that's kind of a bold and a lot of words to begin with. And we wanted to first just introduce you to what we call as a temporary organizational zone called the Transition Resource Circle. And it's some work that we've been co-guiding for a few years now, essentially to sit with the inquiry of what is it for us to engage in transition pathways in this moment of what is called the meta crisis or the poly crisis or the many crises that are upon us, what we're referring to as the collapse of modernity itself and our ways of seeing and being. And the second piece of that is resources. And here we hold a prayer and intention, a line of work that seeks to both liberate and alchemize wealth in service to life. And we say circle because we recognize that we need to do this in ways that are not hierarchical, that recognize our entangled, interconnected ways of being together. And in this, what you'll hear us talk about of ancient, emergent, futuristic ways, circle ways that we actually know in our bones to respond to these transition pathways and the liberation of capital. So welcome. And Alnoor is just going to give us an overview of how this is the first of a 5 webinar series arc. And today we are your hosts, and we will be hosting and have other guests in weeks ahead. And after Alnoor and I kind of speak some of the key lines of the book on this first webinar, we will invite some of those who are in our accompaniment circle and other key allies to join in with us in dialogue. And then we'll open it up for the broader discussion with all of you. And so Alnoor can speak about what's coming ahead in the arc of our webinar series. And I'm going to just pull that up.
Yeah, hello everyone. Nice to see so many familiar faces and new faces. So for today, what we'll do, maybe I'll start there, is we'll have about 45 minutes of sharing some of the key lines of the book, and then we'll open up, as Lynn says, to our accompaniment circle for 15-20 minutes and get some of their questions and comments, and then we will open it up to the broader group here. We'll do Q&A through the chat box, and or if you want to unmute yourself. So today is around from paradox to possibility towards life-centric realities, and it's really the key lines of the book, and that's going to serve as the source material, if you will, for these upcoming conversations. The second session is going to be in January, on January 13th, and that's with Vandana Shiva and Rupa Marya, the author of Inflamed. And it's going to be about moving from ontologies of separation, domination, and extraction to what we call liberation ontologies, beyond dualism and beyond philanthrocapitalism. Session 3, the February session, is about hospicing modernity and pathways for transition, and that's with Vanessa Andriotti and dear elder brother of ours, Teokasin Ghost Horse. And then the 4th session, which is the March session, will be about other ways of knowing, being, and sensing, with a dear brother of ours, Bayo Akomolafe, Nigerian poet and philosopher. And then we're leaving the 5th session, the April session, open to emergence. So we're going to hear back from folks and hear where they want to go deeper, and as a community, how we can deepen our praxis together. So that's the overarching frame for this 5-part webinar series. Also, just to say that these calls will be recorded we're recording now, and if people are uncomfortable with that, you can turn your video off. And when you ask questions, you can use the chat box if you prefer. We also want to thank Adam. You'll see Adam coming in and out. He is the research fellow for Transition Resource Circle and a dear ally. He was really a co-author of the book and knows this content really well, and is the millennial in the crew. So he's doing all the back-end magic to make this Zoomiverse a reality for us.
Yeah, thank you, Adam.
Shall we start?
Yeah.
And if there are questions, you can put them in the chat box. Lynn and I won't be tending that, but Adam will, and he'll let us know if there's anything urgent, if you can't hear us or tech cuts out or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So
we wanted to start with the prayer that we wrote in the beginning of the book, and Adam will put it in the chat box as well. And it's our endeavor that may this text, may this webinar serve the healing of all beings, including the fallen deity of money and its offspring, the shadow and alibi of philanthropy. May the colonized mind and body be liberated, including our own. So we want to dedicate this time to the healing of all beings, including this deity of money, philanthropy, to the liberation of all of us. And with that, we felt perhaps it would be useful to begin, as we do in the book, in the prologue, with a couple of paradoxes that we sit with as we wrote this book, as we sit here and speak today about this content. And the first of that paradox is the one that there are many that we spell out, but I'm going to just highlight a few here today. And the first one is the paradox of pronouncement. And here we recognize that language is both incredibly useful for us and is evocative and helps us create and see and be in this reciprocal exchange. And we also are trying to open to a non-dual embodied cognition that is beyond the written word and beyond the hegemony of the written word, and indeed the hegemony of the English written word. And in this way that we're speaking today, we recognize that there are others who have ways of knowing and being that are more rooted in oral traditions, and yet we recognize that we're still here speaking in English, and we're going to be using analysis and rational thought, even as we invoke the non-dual, and even as we invoke beyond that which we can speak and perceive. So we honor this paradox of pronouncement that we're all in. And the second paradox I just want to speak to today is the paradox of performance. And in this way, there is a way in which we are all still performers of the dominant culture. That we're sitting here on Zooms, that we're, as I already referenced, that we're speaking here in English, that we are even referencing a temporal time element of this collapse that evokes in us a sense of urgency, that evokes in us a sense of we have to analyze to see what is ours to do and how we act, that we need to plan. And we're inextricably linked from this paradox of performance as we perform this culture. And we want to also just recognize this as we find our way through it, to be with what is emergent, to be with that. Alnoor and I are not in this doing this perfectly with the perfect slides and the perfect talking points. We want to tune into the field and each other and see what comes through. So we honor this paradox that we're all inextricably linked in, and see how we can evoke other ways of even being and listening in ourselves to move beyond. And the perhaps the ultimate paradox that this entire inquiry is around is the paradox of post-capitalism and post-capitalist philanthropy itself. And I'm going to say a little bit about post-capitalism and then ask Alnoor to speak to that, and indeed this great paradox that we're embracing. And And let's start with post-capitalism and recognize that the way that we're using this is not a simple linearity of a transition out of an old system into a new system. We're using it in a way as a conceptual container to hold multiple values and ways of being and knowing that are rooted in reciprocity, solidarity, compassion, empathy, reverence for life. And it's a way that we're trying to recognize that we're trying to transition out of a capitalist system that is not just about a market exchange, but is indeed about the extraction and commodification of humans, nature, our relationships. Everything in and of itself is in this realm of extraction and domination and exploitation. And so we invoke post-capitalism to say, what are our cardinal points? What are the root systems that we need to find our way into so we can inhabit another way of being and being in relationship with one another? We say post-capitalism, recognizing there's an ism at the end, but it isn't to invoke yet another ism, to say that this is what comes after socialism or other isms that we're all familiar with. It's to, again, suggest that we're really trying to invoke an interconnected relational way of being, of seeing, and of living. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll see what Alnoor has to add to this, is we didn't put a dash between the post and the capitalism because, as I said before, we're not trying to evoke that there's a world before capitalism and a world after post-capitalism that we're invoking. It's rather that we're trying to invoke a way of seeing and lines of action that are informed by capitalism. And there are some that we're speaking to what these shared values are. And for many of us, we don't actually know what it is to inhabit post-capitalist realities. And for many others on this planet, indeed, they have been living post-capitalist realities since first colonial contact and other temporary autonomous zones. And so the onus is for many of us in the Occidental mind and the Western tradition to find what it is, to excavate what it is about capitalism that lives in our very minds and our bodies and our ways of working, and to find another way that is possible.
Yeah, I think this is really the key point, is that we're using post in the way postmodernists use post, which is it's informed by modernism, it's informed by capitalism, without being able to transcend it necessarily, because capitalism, and it's the most recent incarnation of capitalism, which is neoliberalism, is like the oxygen that we breathe. It's all-encompassing, it's totalitarian in its nature, and it's pervasive. And so in that sense, we say we have to be informed by the logic of the dominant system. We'll also use this term capitalist modernity, which we like. It's a term from Abdullah Öcalan, who's the founder of the PKK and one of the co-founders of Rojava, the Kurdish resistance and Kurdish state autonomous zone. And why we like it is because it's not just referring to the political economy of capitalism or to the socio-cultural complex of modernity. It's the two together, that it really is a sort of totalizing socio-political, cultural, economic system. And when we say post-capitalism, you know, one of there's a line in the book that says, if you do not have a critique of capitalist modernity, you are contextually irrelevant. But if all you have is a critique, you are spiritually and creatively impoverished. And so the starting place has to be a deep understanding of the oxygen, the impoverishment of our culture, the dominant culture that has been exported from the West, and the latest chapter of that, which is neoliberalism. And we're gesturing towards something else that is informed by values, but we don't know where that destination is. So what part of the exercise that we're engaging in this collective sense-making is to map coordinates of possibility.
And maybe with that, we just offer a little bit about why we wrote this book and why we focus our our gaze of post-capitalism on the complex of philanthropy. And when I said that we're really embracing this ultimate paradox of suggesting that we're speaking about a post-capitalist world, and we're starting to look at where wealth is held and concentrated in this complex, in this industry called philanthropy. And we're really invoking a call for philanthropy to be in the liberation of capital in a way that can support transition pathways. What we refer to as transition pathways is other ways of being and knowing that are in co-creative relationship with life itself. And we will get into this in much more detail as we go. But I just wanted to speak to, we're aware that we're speaking of, we have to be contextually relevant in this moment, we recognize that the current Western way of living and working is only going to go on for, we don't know exactly how long, but not that much longer. We often will say 5 to 10 years without getting into a debate about the temporal dimension. But we all recognize many are already feeling the pinch of inflation and the seeds of recession coming. And so the paradox is there a moment in time that we can actually use capital to build post-capitalist ways of being, post-capitalist infrastructure, these transition pathways that will honor life and support us in these transitions?
We were also sitting with the question of why are we writing a book on philanthropy, and it sort of came to us many times, and in many ways this is not a book about philanthropy, and it's much more than philanthropy, and yet it is rooted in philanthropy. And part of the reason is that philanthropy is in some ways the most symbolic externalization of neoliberal capitalism. Some people have amassed huge amounts of wealth through a rigged game of extraction and destruction of life. And then it's also presented back to us as an alternative to capitalism, that somehow philanthropy can solve the problems that capital created in the first place. And in many ways, that is the fundamental paradox and the absurdity of modern philanthropy. Another reason is that philanthropy, if we take it as a sector or an industry, or as a biome, as we say in the book, it's a massive, massive sector. It's about $2.2 trillion. So it's equivalent to the GDP of Canada, a G7 country. It would be one of the top 10, maybe top 8 industries in the world. And it's completely occluded, very little transparency, labyrinth rules and systems, opaque, and almost no public discourse about it. And then importantly, I come from a background of being an activist and an organizer. Lynn has also worked in philanthropy. What we realize is that every social movement, all not-for-profits, civil society at large is all funded by philanthropy, whether that's quote unquote state philanthropy, government grants, or private institutional philanthropy or family foundations, unless you're running a volunteer, Gandhiite movement in India or something. And even then, philanthropy will find its ways to I won't use the word dominate, but insinuate itself into even informal social movements. And so we can't talk about social change unless we have a conversation about philanthropy, which is the upstream driver of who's doing what, who's getting paid for social change work, how are they funded, who's working for that organization, the efficacy of that organization, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the why philanthropy, and maybe we'll start going into the content of the book. Before we do that, maybe we'll just take a pause for a second in a collective breath. Are you going to say something else before I start?
Just going to say that indeed the book, as Alnoor just said, with the pause and some of the reflections that we have in the book and other pieces, for us, and this webinar series is a space where we really want to be in this collective sense making together at this critical crossroads. So while we're going to offer and continue to offer content in this, the deeper inquiry really is for all of us to be in this collective sense making at this juncture. And With that, Alnoor is going to move us into really understanding the waters that we're swimming in.
I'm going to share screen. And I see there's a question in the Q&A, and you can keep questions going. And when we open up in about 30 minutes or so, we'll address the questions. We want to start here as just a point of analysis. And so we also have shared language and a shared understanding of let's say, the approach. And the approach we're taking, you could call it a structural historical perspective. And by structural, what we mean is that when we analyze the dominant cultural operating system, because it's more than a political economy, it's a, as we've said, a totalizing operating system, and we're going to call it neoliberalism. And we can think of neoliberalism as the latest chapter of capitalist modernity. So it's what we're facing now. What's unique about it is that it's simultaneously a political philosophy, economic practice, but also a cosmology, a worldview, an ontology. It defines a way to see the world, onto being vision. And it's a theocracy. It's a religious worldview based on faith. And most of the dogmas of neoliberalism have been proven to be false, and yet it is still what is taught in every economics course in the West, and aspects of it are infused in all parts of culture. And so I could just say a little bit about some of these key premises and why it's so much bigger than political economy. One of them, the first being that it has a point of view on what human beings are and what our purpose is in the world. Neoliberalism says humans are inherently selfish and competitive, right? That we are red in tooth and claw. And this is our natural state. And from Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution and the evolution of scientism and even evolutionary theory, there's an entire complex of high priests of neoliberalism that push this dogma. And as a result, our structures, how systems are created, are based on this belief. The second is that hierarchy is inevitable and necessary for order. That if human beings were left to their own devices, anarchy would ensue. And therefore, there's a justification for hierarchy, for patriarchy, for white supremacy that is embedded within the logic of the system. The third is that the individual is the primary unit of power. That the individual is the locus by which we need to view the world. Most people on this call will know Margaret Thatcher's famous line that there's no such thing as the individual, no such thing as society, there's only the individual and family. And in this sense, it is an atomizing ideology, and it pins people against each other, especially when you merge it with the two pillars before that of hierarchy and competition. The fourth is that material wealth and power determine our well-being, life meaning, success, and virtue. So if you have money, you are inherently good, deserving, worthy, etc. And if you do not, you are a moral failure. It's completely ahistorical. There's almost zero discourse in neoliberal and neoclassical economics and how that wealth was acquired in the first place, which we know it was colonialism, imperialism, genocide, pillage, accumulation by dispossession, as David Harvey would say. And so there's a very deep moral philosophy, one could argue a kind of an ongoing Christian capitalist coloniality that is imposed into the present moment. And then finally, neoliberalism and its predecessors of industrial capitalism and even proto-capitalism were based on separation from the natural world. And we call it sort of separation or dualism that, the first dualism was Descartes' famous dualism of the mind-body split, right? We have these godlike minds and we have these animalistic bodies, and the two are separate. And then that worldview gets imposed onto the so-called outside external world, and we are separate from it. And then new hierarchies are created of what is mind and what is nature, which end up elevating the white male European body and othering women, indigenous peoples, peoples of culture, bodies of culture, etc. And so the separation and dualism married materialism during Enlightenment. And what we mean by materialism is that the world can be reduced to the atom, and then the atom can be reduced to the proton and the electron and the neutron. And now with quantum physics, the photon and the quark and what have you. But importantly, that we can not only reduce the material world to its constitutive parts, but that we can also understand it through the rational mind. That the world can and will make sense to human rational thought. And this is what scientists arrogantly call the grand unified theory of everything, right? This is the pinnacle point of the scientific method, is to achieve this intellectual domination over a separate material world that we can rationally understand. That is the core ontology, that is the core cosmology of neoliberal capitalism. And what it does is that it infuses every aspect of our lives. And so people will say, well, technology will get us out of this the situation we're in, which we can call, for our purposes, we'll call it the meta crisis or the poly crisis, which means that these crises of climate change and ecological collapse and species extinction and spiking pandemics and peak inequality, et cetera, perpetual violence and war, that these things are not externalities that the existing system can figure out, but they are the logical outcomes of the existing system. And so any lens we use to say, well, technology will save the day, well, technology is an extension and an externality of neoliberal capitalism. There are people deciding what gets funded, what R&D gets funded, who are the people making those decisions at universities. So you see that technology is a subset. And we can take the same logic and bring it into any other sector. It's easier to see in a sector like media or the military industrial complex or big pharma or big finance or big ag or what have you. But for some reason, people find this logic slightly confusing when it comes to philanthropy. During our interviews, Lynn and I interviewed a couple of people who had come into huge amounts of wealth and were just setting up their philanthropy, and they would be very optimistic at first. They would have these huge sort of ranges of potential of what they believe they could achieve. And then we would talk to them 6 months later or a year later, and they would understand that the entire IRS code, for example, in the US, and the structure of philanthropy is geared in such a way that they save their endowment, that they protect their capital base, and that they give the least amount that they can give, the 5% minimum giving threshold. And that there's an army of lawyers, of consultants, of accountants, of family members that put pressure to ensure that philanthropy remains as an extension and an externality of neoliberalism. And then you just bring that logic down, right? There's people in institutions who think they can make change, and maybe on some levels they can, but at the same time, they're just fractal nodes of the broader sector, which is one aspect of neoliberalism. And we take this down to an individual level, right? And as individuals, we're replicators of neoliberalism, not just intellectually, cognitively, mimetically, but somatically. Right? Our physical bodies, we have given somatic real estate to aspects of neoliberalism, right? This is what colonization is. And one of the things we say is that, there's an invisible hand that lives within all of us, because how deep the conditioning and entrainment of the logic of neoliberalism is. So we'll just take a pause. And the visual is just essentially saying that, right? It's showing the fractal replicating nature of neoliberalism.
And maybe just to say, and the pause is an invitation with what Alnoor just outlined is a lot of these structures out there for how these structures show up within all of us, whether we sit within a foundation or we sit within an NGO or others. Where is it that the logic of the separate self comes in? Where is it that we see that a group of people who have amassed wealth and therefore power, we may have an unconscious biases towards somehow thinking that they then have the right and the entitlement to decide what are the problems of the world, how you go about solving those problems, where indeed you even put those monies into communities. There's not necessarily a process by which that communities decide who comes in or countries decide who comes in to work on these problems that have been decided outside. And many of us have that even within ourselves in the way that we're trying to respond to the meta crisis right now, that we have this sense of urgency and this compulsion. So we get to do something, but yet is it being driven by I can see better, or I know better, or I can just brush past the step of humility and listening and tending to the relational field, even as messy as that may be. And so what as you go through the book, and maybe we'll get into this in some of the discussion, we're really trying to recognize the fractal nodes of how this shows up in both the industry of philanthropy, the actual institutions themselves, and in even the individuals within it. And we are saying this within philanthropy, but as I was suggesting, this could be those of us who work in different versions of the nonprofit, what we call the NGO industrial complex or other places. And this is we really want to interrogate the way that we uphold these systems and structures.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe you want to say something about
we just included some of the artwork from the book. This is by Fede Cruz, who's a Mexican artist, activist, organizer. And he's just riffing on this term that we use in the book, which is recharacterizing, the Anthropocene or the Kali Yuga, this period we're in as the age of consequence.
So as we went and spoke with many and did a lot of reading, and indeed kind of our engagement with different activists, different movements around the world, we recognize that there is a growing set of people, groups, endeavors that are really recognizing this neoliberal operating system that we're working within. And they have many different ways that they're going about this. It's a growing movement. And for our purposes here, we kind of refer to this as the just transition movement. And we really want to honor a lot of the work that is going on in response to this dominant operating system. And as we continue to listen and really try to understand what is happening within this movement, we again and again kept looking at this very simple framework that was first developed by Bill Sharp, and it's called the 3 Horizon framework. And as we looked at it and we saw that there are many that are responding to, whether you want to say climate change or the meta crisis, we started to see that a lot of within philanthropy and some of the NGO sector was still really in what we would call the Horizon 1, continuing to uphold the system as it is, but moving towards reform. So you could think of the Green New Deal being in that, or the work that's still trying to look at how do we capture carbon and do carbon markets? How do we improve and reform our democracy, our systems of democracy? There's a whole movement even in philanthropy that's called the New Economy movement that is still trying to make capitalism more humane or more ecologically relevant, if you will. And so we were looking at this saying, okay, we see a lot of this work in Horizon 1. What we see in terms of this Horizon 2, which is trying to disrupt the current way that we're seeing our systems and our structures and our ideologies, this work in Horizon 2 would be work that we often talk about of transition pathways, the work of justice, the work that is trying to bring in equity consciousness or decolonization efforts, the work that is trying to say, let's stand in solidarity with different movements, with navigating those who've been historically harmed by colonization and capitalism, and indeed to this day. And what we saw when we looked at the Horizon 2 work is we saw that a lot of the work was still in tactic and in the realm of the ontological, like it was still navigating the material realm. In other words, it was saying, let's change who has the money and who has the power, but we're still operating within the frame of modernity. And in that, we continued to see that there was a sincere dearth of the collective imagination for what this Horizon 3 might be, what actually a whole other way of post-capitalist reality ways of living, of seeing, of some of the values of what we were speaking to in post-capitalism. And in Bill Sharp's framework, it is acknowledging that this Horizon 3 is some perhaps parallel, adjacent, emerging future that we're not yet towards, and is looking for those disruptive innovations in the Horizon 2 that might get us to Horizon 3. And so we use this to help crystallize our thinking around this. And as I said before, what we were recognizing in this just transition movement is there is a lot that's going on in there. There's a lot of work around the solidarity economies. There's a lot of work about transitioning who makes the decision of who has the financial resources. There's a lot of shifting into how do you actually make philanthropy work through trust-based. There's a lot going on for the time horizon by which the monies are given away, spend down, spend in, a number of different things. But we kept looking at a couple of assumptions, and it was assuming almost a linearity of, we're going to take the power and the money from the elites, and we're going to put it in the hands of the community and the peoples. And what we know throughout history is many different social movements over the past hundreds of years have endeavored to make that shift. But unless we actually get down into the deeper thought forms that underlie power and domination themselves, we're not actually in a co-liberatory kind of framework. And so this led us to looking at a way that the work of justice is an ever ongoing action. It's not a static state of being that we arrive, but it's an endeavor that we practice again and again. We referenced a dear brother, Bayo Komolafe, and in an interview we did with him, he said, and Alnoor may be able to help me get this right, justice will give you a seat at the table, but it will never let you leave the house of modernity. And so this for us turned into a way that we were trying to see two things that were going on. Well, maybe three. First is just to acknowledge all the work that is happening around justice right now. This is why we're invoking the just transition, all the work that is going on to decolonize philanthropy, to work on racial equity, and many other lines of this work. We also simultaneously started to notice that there was efforts going on in the way that we even talk about and perceive wealth itself. So how do we broaden our understanding of wealth? And we had a wonderful sets of conversations with Taj James, who said that if we imagine that capital is like energy and it wants to flow like water, water will move to the lowest places, that the capital wants to flow. And anything that is not flowing is a continuation of the colonial project. So this starts to tell us that there's a whole other conception coming in about wealth, not just where it flows, but how this energy of capital wants to flow. And the other thing is that we started to notice in this, to that Horizon 3, that there was a real dearth of systemic alternatives to our existing sets of ways of seeing and working, and that it was so hard to get outside of the project of neoliberalism that we couldn't actually see what was possible in that Horizon 3 construct. So for us, we started to look at, we need a just transition plus an entire shift of ontology, ethico-onto-epistemological, what we shorthand call onto-shifts or ontological shifts. And what we mean by that is that we cannot create a different world unless we start to shift our very way that we understand our knowledge, the way that we even think about what we think and can see. We need to shift how we see and how we relate with each other, what we speak of as ontology, our cosmological view of what we can see and what we can't see. And we need an ethical interaction response to go along with our understanding, our ontological shifts, and indeed a serious interrogation into our epistemological view. And so this, what Alnoor just put up, was a graphical representation of what is it for us to go from these pyramid logics, this dominant system, and start to shift our gaze into what we will talk about as spiral logic, as trans logic, as other ways where we sit first and foremost, not just saying that it's the work of philosophers and mystics and others to sit with these first principle questions of ontology, but indeed it's the responsibility of all of us who are taking full responsibility for what it means to be alive in these times, for how do we see, how do we know what we know, how do we think about what we know that we know, how do we behave in accordance to what we see and what we know, and what is our set of ethics that goes along with that. We recognize that there are many different indigenous communities who've been sitting in what we're invoking of this verbing of a way of being that is ontological shifts, and have done this for many decades, centuries, that have had to navigate what we're speaking to in terms of post-capitalist realities. And for someone like me who was born in the country of the US, who came into life as a white presenting woman, it is the work of my life to innerly and outerly work to dismantle oppressive systems simultaneously while I'm actually working to shift my consciousness about how I respond. For the sake of time, I'm going to see if perhaps we speak to one or two of these, but what we set up is not a binary of here's one side of it and here's the other, but we call this a continuum of onto-shifts. Continuum meaning that it's not just a either or back into the binary thinking, and the onto-shifts plural, because we recognize that this is an ever ongoing, and it's in moment by moment. It's even the way that I'm sitting here perceiving whether I'm a separate self from Alnoor, from this table, from this computer screen. Am I actually seeing this as a relational fabric, or am I thingifying to assert my domination over in any given moment? And so in this way, especially looking to philanthropy and what we're invoking here, we wanted to just point out a couple of these, and one of them being this ahistorical amnesia. And here we often have seen that the sector has focused a lot on technical, rational solutions. It does not have necessarily a long historical gaze to understand the very structures that we're swimming in. And in that way, it tends to focus on novelty and what is new and what's the next and emerging. And as I've heard Alnoor say before, being almost phobic present, or have a phobia of just sitting in the presence, sitting in the messiness, remembering from what we came from, and engaging in the deep work of reparations and reconciliation, not through a place of trying to be righteous or trying to be right or trying to do good, but because we are inextricably linked for one another. My liberation is bound up with your liberation. And in that way, there have been deep historical harms and fissures. And so if we have this ahistorical amnesia, it lends us into technological fixations on some sort of futurism that jumps over the present of now. Or maybe you want to speak of one of these others, and then you can move us into.
Yeah, and we talked about some of this in the neoliberalist pyramid logic, but in terms of philanthropy, the sort of two obvious ones are moving from this culture of attribution and competition, right? Funders often take credit for giving grants to grassroots organizers and social movements, and one of the people we interviewed called it the halo logo ego model of philanthropy, and the continuum we're invoking is more of service and solidarity, thinking as funder activists who it's not their money, right? That the world's wealth is our collective endowment, and stewarding a disproportionate amount of that wealth has more responsibility and also has spiritual political implications that we have no idea about, and to be in contemplation of that. And rather than being in the game of accumulation of capital, how do we move to the liberation of capital, to spend down these funds in this short window of time we have when capital is useful? This was a piece of art from a dear sister, Afro-Brazilian artist, Afro-Colombian artist, Elixa Garcia. So I'm going to move us to the last two frameworks. And I know there's a lot of content on the day, and I'm not going to spend so much time on this because I want to get into the 5 elements mandala, which comes next. But essentially part 3 of the book is focused on this spiral. And the gist of the spiral is we need to move from kind of this linear pyramid logic to more of a trans logic, to spiral ways that are multi-directional, that are reflexive, so they're feeding off each other, they're interconnected, and that starts with having a point of view on cosmology. And in some ways, in order to understand what you stand for, you have to understand what you stand against. You have to decode the dominant culture. And then also what it requires is to recast the individual as a non-individual. That, even at a cellular level, that we have, more matter in our body through bacteria and gut biome beings that are just on a weighted level more than so-called us. And that, even from a neuroscience perspective, that every neuron in our brain is connected to 10,000 other neurons and multiple neural pathways. And so, as the Ubuntu cosmology says, we are who we are through others. And that's a sort of recasting the atomized individualistic worldview, and then having that embedded within social ecologies, which are like social movements, communities, groups of beings, human and otherwise, which are embedded in these biomes, which unite social ecologies. So thinking of sectors as sort of living biomes that are in service to something bigger than the sector, which it's hard for philanthropy to imagine that at this current point in the juncture. But imagine that all these various biomes are feeding social ecologies in service to a different type of superstructure. The current superstructure we call neoliberalism or capitalist modernity, but thinking of it in a mycelial way. How do we create resilient, bioregional, sovereign communities that are not divided by artificial state lines, but where rivers start and begin, where forests start and begin, where mountains start and begin, truly bioregional sovereignty, land sovereignty, food sovereignty, energy, medicine, education, cultural sovereignty, in service to something bigger than that. It's not just a localist project. It's embedded within the Gaian entelechy, within this planetary ecology. And by entelechy, what we mean is that Gaia herself is a living being, has her own will and her own agency, that through ontological shifts, we can learn and practice to be in dialogue with, to be in call and response with, to be in service to. And that requires a certain amount of humility and a move from materialism to animism, a move from rationalism to relationalism. Anything else on this before we?
I think we'll come back to this, and maybe this will show you how we started to look as philanthropy specifically as a biome. But just the provocation here is, if we ourselves don't see ourselves as separate individuals, but indeed webs of relationships, if we do become astute students of dominant culture and we understand our ontology, what does that do to shift the whole sector and the relations? Where philanthropy then isn't looking to get tax breaks and not pay taxes in the communities where they sit, where the actual institutions sit, but instead see the sets of relationships, and the gaze starts to shift, not just around who gets the grants or what the endowments are invested in, but where is all of the relational fabric. So this is kind of the consciousness that we're invoking as we speak to the transition pathways and the 5-element mandala, that we're going to give you a bunch of lines of the coordinate points, but we're continuing with even what we say on that to continue to work in our praxis to shift our ontological gaze.
Yeah, so we only have a couple of minutes left, and then we're going to open up to questions. There's another piece by Fede. So one response that we came up with, sort of coming out of spiral logic, is what would be a way that we would want to approach if, let's say someone gave us $1 billion, and what we sat with was this idea of the 5 elements mandala, and the starting place for it is these two axes, and it's not an X and Y kind of linear 4-quadrant graph, but it's more of a living mandala. It's part of circle ways, and so the horizontal line is really one of restoration and solidarity, that we cannot create the so-called new without addressing the historical harms that have been created. And what that means in practice is, on the left side, we start with solidarity with indigenous peoples, the tributaries, the veins, the waterways of Pachamama, and the not just historical, but the current stewards of life on this planet. We've heard this often, but less than 5% of the world's population stewarding more than 80% of the world's biodiversity. And these are the intact cultures that have a direct line to symbiotic relationships and an understanding of place that will be necessary in post-capitalist past, present, futures. On the other side, the fire is the solidarity with social movements, historically marginalized peoples who are organizing their voice and their bodies and at a local level, that the demands of social movements are necessary for whatever is going to emerge, and that these two are the sort of the balance, the horizontal line that holds down the mandala. The next is the vertical axis that we call transformation and creation, and at the root of that is the earth element, which is the creation of post-capitalist infrastructure, land sovereignty, food sovereignty, water, medicine, energy, cultural sovereignty, educational sovereignty, and really creating, what Abdullah Öcalan would call sort of a democratic confederalism, or what some people would call localism, what others would call, anarchist organizational structures, which doesn't mean no government. It just means the role of government should be to localize power to the communities and peoples that are living the lived experience of political economy. And at the top of that is the air element, which is about creating new, ancient, emerging cultural contexts This is the space of narrative work, of culture hacking work, of artivism, of interventions that change the logic of the dominant system, that change the value system by which we deem ideas important or in public dialogue. And so we go to the fifth element, and maybe you want to speak about the element of ether.
So this fifth element is, as Alnoor said, ether, and it's life force itself. And the ether is at the center of the mandala, and the mandalas represent a journey within and a journey without. And we saw that all of this pivots around life force itself. And here, this is everything from the work to acknowledge trauma, not to make us better adjusted to the conditions of modernity, but actually to acknowledge the life force and to reconnect ourselves, to remember life force itself. It's the work of embodiment, of working with some do nature awareness work, the work to connect to the earth, but it's to acknowledge our relational web with the rivers, with the land, with each other, and to not thwart and be in our what many would call our fight, flight, or freeze response, or our amygdala hijack, but to actually allow this current of life to express itself through ourselves and to connect with others in those ways. And so we see this at the center of this praxis, this ongoing praxis of what it is to be in solidarity, not to assert it, but to find our way again and again of what is it to actually stand in solidarity with one another. What is it to actually enter the co-creative state change of transformation in response to the lack of collective imaginary of what post-capitalist realities could be, in a way that we need to support us to actually do the arduous work of building post-capitalist infrastructure.
So those are all the elements in the complete mandala. And there's lots more detail, of course, around this in the book. And it's just a framework, right? We don't think the 5 elements mandala is the answer. We don't believe in the answers. David Abram has a line in Spell of the Sensuous where he says, there's no such thing as objective truth with a capital T. There's only the quality of relationships. And so what we're trying to do with invoking a mandala is to have a framework that is remixable, that is reusable, that is a starting point for discussion, not some kind of binary framework to have tidy answers. And then this is the last slide we're going to share today before we open up to the accompaniment circle and broader questions. And I'll just let Lynn say a little bit about it.
So as we sat with that 3 horizons framework that I suggested before about what is Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3, and we ourselves took ourselves really deeply into the journey of spiral logic and what Alnoor just offered of our subjective view of this 5-element mandala, which is our offering of some transition pathways. We really sat with, where are we in this moment? Where, if we really sit with this presence and what we see happening within the meta crisis, this moment of collapse, we felt deeply, this came to us again and again. What is it for us to surrender to this moment that we're in, surrender to our addiction to comfort, our addiction to certainty, our addiction to the way that we continue to want to have the world the way that we see it? And what is it to just surrender control to what is happening? If we're truly in a co-creative animistic world where we're in call and response, and we actually surrender where we are, can we then embrace this moment that we're in collapse as an initiatory moment, that we can traverse and cross a threshold, and that we can find a way to re-enter this continuum of life that always was and ever has been, that we in our Occidental conditioning of dualism and separatism and the thousands of years of exerting domination over each other and the earth, we separated ourselves out of the continuum of life. And so in this offering of surrender the control, traverse the threshold to this initiatory moment, re-enter this continuum of life, it's an offering that we may walk each other into the unknown.
Okay, we're going to stop there. Yeah, so before we open up questions more broadly, we have some dear friends and allies and comrades on this Zoom that have really accompanied us from the beginning of the process, and wanted to see if any of them want to speak. We also have Feroz Manji, who is an elder in the Pan-African movement, who runs the not-for-profit Daraja Press that co-published the book with us, and we also want to invite Feroz to speak. So yeah, Feroz or Orland or Tiokasin or Andrea, Colin, Peter Lippman, Kumi. There's a group of folks, so we'll just let you unmute, or you can raise your hand and Adam can unmute if you can't do that yourself.
I mean, I think first of all, I'd like just to say what a beautiful, beautiful design of this book. The beauty of the language. It's almost poetry in prose. I think it's and reflects, I think, very well the core element of what you are seeking to convey, and that's the importance of the spirit, the human spirit. And I'm really impressed the way in which both the artwork, the design, and the language and the way in which you've written is consistent with that. And I think that's quite a remarkable achievement. Things I felt open for discussion is that this conversation is taking place in a way that doesn't necessarily immediately give voice to those that capital condemns to the sacrifice zones, les damnés de la terre. And it's important to recognize that the wretched of the earth have a capacity to think, and to think emancipatory thoughts, and to organize on that basis. And it's those voices that need to be heard in this debate, this discussion about the role of post-capitalist philanthropy. That's to say, there are many, many movements that are not funded. They depend on the solidarity of its membership, of its community, and that is a different form, but it could fall under the heading of philanthropy. And I think that needs to be considered. And it's really important because the way in which, for example, Abahlali Bashmandolo in South Africa, the shack dwellers movement organized, is by a community contributions. The way that the Mathare social justice centers operate the same way. And I think that's why it's important to consider how actually in today's world and historically, people have organized, and how self-supporting philanthropy is a core element in that process of change. The capital of philanthropists pour money, the effect of which is to NGOize these movements, and furthermore tends towards splitting and acrimony. And it's been used very powerfully. A good example is what happened in Eastern Congo, in the Kivu area, where these movements had organized, and then suddenly all these money came in, and the movement completely disintegrated with internecine fights. any family that inherits you will from its rich parents or whatever, you will see the same phenomenon beginning. And I think that's a really important dimension to keep in mind in saying, well, capital of philanthropy is problematical right in its core. And so the alternative solidarity movements, etc., are really important. And I think, again, just to repeat and emphasize that none of this is possible without accepting and understanding the collective spirit that makes humanity, especially in its best moments of struggle. So let me leave it there, and thank you for involving me in this conversation.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Feroz.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Feroz.
honored to be entangled with you.
Mhm.
And I think it's also important to say that, big philanthropy with a capital P is not just giving money to social movements in a neutral way. It's often done with a strategy to create and sow disharmony and discord in these movements. And it has been a purposeful strategy. And then, of course, there's also what happens in families that exists, right? That capital taints relational lines, and there is no easy or good way to do it. And people are experimenting, community-led foundations, flow funding, basic incomes for key leaders in the movement, and there is no perfect way to do it. And yeah, thank you for presencing that.
I was listening to you. What came up for me was this question of scale, and maybe the tyranny in some ways, or the paradox of scale in all of this. So I'm thinking of the third pathway, or the third horizon, sorry.
Third horizon.
Yeah. And in terms of post-capitalist ways of being and seeing and living, and the ways in which I guess I think, and it reflects a little bit what Feroz was saying, there are, I think, a lot of communities out there that are in a state of flow where they're not looking to the accumulated banks of capital. And I'm reflecting here of what Alnoor was talking about, philanthropy being like the GDP of Canada. I think it's a really important conversation, but I feel like this is going a little bit into that horizon too, which is how do we start shifting those accumulated flows into new areas and possibly creating an NGO industrial complex, or adding to it in some ways, that movements have to be in that mode. I see the possibility of a horizon 3, and Alnoor, you kind of dismissed this a little bit as these cute Gandhians, but there is a horizon 3 where there are people and communities that are operating where you don't need a huge amount of accumulated capital. And it is like water, and it's constantly flowing because it's all happening in very small scale, multiplied interactions of goodness flowing. So in that sense, it's just a reflection. I mean, I feel like there's something not fully acknowledged there. And I just wanted to name that. And I think it relates to scale. Like when we're talking about trying to shift things at the level, or creating a sector that is at the level of the GDP of Canada, we're falling into that same tyranny of thinking about it in that way. So to me, it's almost the way in which it's been outlined is almost a horizon 1 or a horizon 2 thing, and not fully horizon 3.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe two quick things on that. One is, we're not dismissing Gandhiites, and I don't think anyone said the word cute, but just to say that they're some of the few groups that are not requiring philanthropic funding. That was the reference. And it's really only informal movements. And what we even see with informal movements, Feroz mentioned slum dwellers, shack dwellers. SDI now in South Africa is getting Ford Foundation money. La Via Campesina, the world's largest social movement, does get money from arguably good intermediaries like Grassroots International, but who then themselves have to go and raise money from the bigger philanthropic complex. And so, of course, there's a people aspect and a social movement aspect to organizing outside of philanthropy. But this is really, the content of this book is really focused on what philanthropy can do. And one of the main things we say is to build post-capitalist infrastructure. So money is not required, right? To invest money in what we call biophysical assets, food sovereignty and land sovereignty. So historically marginalized peoples can, at a local level, determine their own realities outside of market systems.
And I would just perhaps add two things to that. In the way that is done, the investment in that, or getting out of the entire notion of investment, but actually the transfer of resources, the way that we're calling for this ontological shift. So we actually are starting with what is it to live reciprocity? What is it to like grapple with power, with the impulse to say it's going to get messy if I put the monies into this land trust and there's not equity consciousness, like catching ourselves at every step that we still want to control and have dominion over. So there's a whole set of things that we're pointing to that we invoke as transition pathways, but we're also calling for all this deeper work that's suggesting that we really need to embrace this ontological shift so we can actually find what you're speaking to, which is that Horizon 3, these parallel adjacent realities, these post-capitalist realities. And the other piece I want to add is we recognize that there are many people across this planet, seems to us often in the geopolitical South, who are living these what we refer to as some of these post-capitalist values that you yourself are speaking of, and aren't necessarily looking to large sums of money, but are in the spirit of reciprocity. We don't speak a lot about it explicitly because we're not trying to romanticize or exotify through the gaze, but we recognize that there are resistance movements. Alnoor mentioned one of them in Rojava. There's others that we know that our dear friends and allies in India through the Global Tapestries Alliance are like looking to who actually is living what some of us are starting to grok could be possible in this Horizon 3. And there are many other. We don't want to just speak to examples, and part of why Alnoor and I haven't upheld so many of the people and projects and places that are living the transition pathways is because we didn't want to be in the place of curating who is doing this work through our subjective gaze, and or limiting the collective imaginary for what actually is possible, but instead actually ourselves try to embody what is solidarity and who do we have strong relationships with that we can ourselves listen to how we're contributing to these transition pathways. And I really appreciate the point, Preetha, deeply, and thank you for accompanying us and being with us on this journey.
I would just add, I think in addition to that, like when I think of Horizon 3, there, when I talk about scale, there are ways of living dominantly within the system because it permeates everything, as we know, and having like 2-3%. And this is why I think it is connected to scale, having a 2 to 3% like an engagement where communities are trying to raise consciousness of different ways of being. And it may not materially, they may still be operating within the dominant system in terms of the ways in which people self-support themselves. And yet there might be just creating little windows of openings that continue to expand. I think there's something about just naming scale that I feel, if we're trying to get quickly to the other side, then probably we will need large sums of capital, and it's hard for me to imagine how that could end well. Let me put it that way, as opposed to just operating with little tiny increasing cracks and windows of consciousness and new ways of, as you say, the ontological shifts.
And also acknowledging what's happened with capitalist modernity is that we used to have many ways to acquire goods and services: hunting, fishing, bartering, gifting, and that has been mediated by capital. Like indigenous peoples can't even fish in or hunt in many of their own spaces because it's been sort of co-opted within the purview of the state. And so now there's one way to acquire goods and services, which is debt-based capital. And the rise of fiat currency in the 1500s and the simultaneous expansion of colonialism and imperialism by Western Europe and the rest of the world sort of merged. And so as colonialism and the kind of Christian missionary expansionist project went to other places in the world, it also imposed one way to acquire goods and services, which is why Western Europeans have a 500-year head start on capital, right? And there's a direct correlation between descendants of Western Europeans and concentration of wealth. And so there's this question of like, are there ways to organize outside of capital, and how do we be sensitive to also the degrading force of capital and all its historical antecedents, right? New Age people often say, well, capital is just energy, money is just energy. And it's also has the historical charge of accumulation by dispossession and the destruction that was required to create and maintain the structures of capitalist imperialism in the first place. And I guess one more thing to add is also just we're not trying to be in the binary of good and bad, but it's like how do we be conscious of these layers of reality that simultaneously exist, and also be self-aware enough of the culture to stand outside of what the culture tells us, which is more capital is better. Right, and all of these things are sort of playing out at the same time, and we try to get into the nuance of this and the non-dualistic nature of grappling with the complexity of the meta crisis and in this strange murky world of philanthropy that promotes it. And part of what we're trying to do is like puncture the pomposity and the arrogance and the hubris of philanthropy that believes that it's going to solve the problem. And part of what we say is part of the crisis is the way philanthropy is entangled in the crisis. That it's not the silver bullet. That there's sort of more than meets the eye.
Perhaps just one last piece on that is often what we've seen is that philanthropy may be funding what they deem as transition pathways without actually a deep inner grappling with how they themselves might be a transition pathway and whether the paradigm is relevant in this moment. And so then what is it to not just think about the dollars, but the endowment, the grant making, the relational fabric, the tax breaks, all of this that might be in service to this transition pathway. And Preetha, your question also made me think, Alnoor and I are sitting here in Central America in a place where when the rains come and if the waters, what we were invoking with the capital flowing, when the waters go too fast, we get landslides, we get erosion. And yet we haven't spoken to that because it's also not for us to have the hubris to say how much is enough and or where exactly those should flow. And I think that's your point as well, is how do we get so many different things going and actually nourish a lot of what's happening in this time without the logic of trying to scale, which is trying to almost put guardrails around where the water is flowing and at what rate.
And there's one thing that's not often spoken is like philanthropy is also important, right? Like we're not saying we should stop philanthropy, but that there should, as we think about hospicing philanthropy in a 10-year, 20-year horizon, that parallels the material limits of growth, right? We've crossed 6 of the 9 planetary bounds. We know that 3% GDP growth essentially means a doubling of the global economy in the next 20 years. And economists and ecologists agree that there will not be another doubling of the global economy. And so let's use the capital that exists to build this post-capitalist infrastructure. And so there is a powerful and useful role of philanthropy. It's just not being done right now by big philanthropy. And then the other important thing is, as those who have acquired and hoarded large amounts of wealth, give those funds away into, ideally post-capitalist infrastructure, food sovereignty, land sovereignty for historically and with historically marginalized peoples, there's going to be less concentration of wealth. And less concentration of wealth is good for democracy. When a few people hold all of that money, democracy and capitalism are in conflict. Democracy says one person, one vote, and capitalism says $1, one vote, and capitalism always wins. And this is the issue of money in politics and many other issues that have come with the hijacking of democracy and are also at the core problem of representative democracy in general.
There's a piece, if you go onto the website or look in the book, as Alnoor and I said, we don't want to be in the business of saying what exactly it is absent kind of the relational fabric and really tending to what comes through the specificity, but also not use that to dodge this. And Andrea, as you speak that question, I mean, I think about things like, what would it be if funders gave 5 to 10 year grants with no milestone reports through a relational basis of trust that doesn't necessarily include like, here's the parameters of exactly what I fund, now fit yourself within it. So there is stuff that we have been thinking through in terms of what disrupts the traditional NGO funder kinds of relationship, but it starts with that relationship. It starts with seeing what is it that we have to do together and listening almost at that level. That's not just a transactional contract, but is something else that's guiding how that relationship is constituted and how it wants to evolve. And Alnoor may have more to say about that, but there's for sure there's work to do to translate this, is what you're speaking to.
Yeah, and also we're thinking like, how do we create spaces where this funder, activist, organizer divide doesn't exist, right? Where we can come into spaces as full humans and have these dialogues about what are the needs of the movement, what are the needs of local communities, and the mechanism of a community foundation does make a lot of sense, right? Instead of putting tens of millions of dollars into one community as kind of a technocratic foundation, better to have local community organizers decide upon themselves and the instead of milestone reports and such things, that the sort of shared accountability amongst the movement or the community, like that is what is shared on more of like a sort of process approach of here's how we come together, here's how we make decisions together, here's how our assembly processes and our direct democracy processes work. And that's a much more interesting way to engage than of course the the bureaucracy of the existing paradigm.
As you ask that question, I just get the imagery of where Alnoor started us, which in the pyramid logic, which we have a culture that seems to consciously and unconsciously want heroes. We want to see that those who have wealth accumulation or those who've become the leader of the institution or organization are somehow there to save us. And I see it as someone who has done a lot of work to understand how, one way I could say it is the white savior complex kind of runs me or my compulsion. I see that same thought form embodied in what you speak to of the hero worship. We have how many awards out there that look to the individual that's making the social change and not necessarily to the collective. I've often thought about what would it be if our gaze went to looking to diverse groups of people working together to find common ground and solve complex problems as kind of a hack on that hero worship that looks instead and tries to uplift those, and especially in a time where we're living through increasing amount of polarization of who is us and them, where do people, the diverse groups of people, come together, perhaps even diverse ideologies coming together to themselves to work on community resiliency. And that's one way that I see this. And again, it goes back to what we're trying to invoke of a practice of solidarity. That's not something that I can assert, but is something that as I perhaps let go of my domination, of my certainty, and I find right relationship, I can listen with whether there's a truth of solidarity that comes through and is not just a one time, but is a deepening and something that arises each time it is practiced. And this actually is one of the things I was reflecting on with Andrea's question about how nonprofits may interpret some of this. I just want to say kind of explicitly what we're speaking to is a political spiritual praxis where we're not trying to separate the professional from the personal, from the individual from the institution, but lean into what is it to actually hold all of life as sacred? What is it to hold our relationships as sacred? And in that way, we can't have the hero worship because you can't see the hero absent all the relationships that even brought that person into our awareness and our attention. It's a true shift of our gaze. And that's one, I wouldn't even say like an answer. I would say one opening response of what I see when I think about, maybe Blessel will speak to this again, but when I think about what happened during the pandemic in places that someone like me may never know, but all the what often is called the mutual aid networks, but the acts of solidarity that happened in communities, in places that during the pandemic just found each other and worked together to put food in the ground, to find whatever need was done. And those in a way have been the most, if I could say the word, inspiring, and I don't mean hopeful, I mean inspiring in the sense of indirect relationship and a co-creative possibility. And then I guess the last thing I would say on this question is for perhaps all of us to interrupt our pattern of hero worship, where we tend to want to find the leader, the person who has the right answer, and actively be in a process of disrupting that tendency within ourselves.
Yeah, I would say, like, of course, the narcissism and the hubris and the hero worship are symptoms of a sick culture. And the dominant culture that started in Western Europe and has been exported all around the world as so-called industrial globalization is at its core separate, rationalist, materialist, and ill. And I think as a starting place, when we say let's be good students of our culture, this is what we mean is like we have to understand the deep impoverishment of the culture that we have been socialized into, for those of us who have been socialized in the West. And that is the starting place for spiritual political praxis, right? The development industry would not exist if that was the starting place, right? How would we even start to try to import the fossil fuel McDonald's live, work, consume, die paradigm if we understood how fundamentally bankrupt it is? And it's so also embedded with our understanding of progress, that what neoliberalism and scientism and dominant paradigms try to say is that progress is an arrow moving ever upwards. The Bill Gates, Steven Pinker worldview, like, look, we have a microwave in every house, the world must be getting better. And it's like, and what has been lost, right? 200 species a day are going extinct, right? 93 cents of every dollar ends up in the hands of the top 1%. Like, all wealth creation is creating inequality and poverty. It doesn't matter how it's done, social capitalism, green growth, whatever. It's all contributing to ecological collapse and climate change, and done in a way that is also creating deep levels of unhappiness and high levels of depression and ennui and disconnection from the living world. And if our starting place is to be good students of our culture and to understand the impoverishment which we're holding up as success, then the next logical outcome is to also be conscientious objectors of neoliberalism. You know, in the 1940s or whatever, it was easier to see who the enemy was, right? The mustachioed fascist. And what's so sophisticated about neoliberalism is that it's a complex, adaptive, evolutionary system. It's alive, not in the way living systems are alive, but in the way artificial intelligence is alive. And it has a set of rules that are generative, that are, of course, man-made. And so if you invent something called compound interest, those with capital are going to have exponential capital, and those with debt are going to have exponential debt. These are just made up systems, but they're generative. And what the living system of neoliberalism does is, it's not a merit system, as we're told, right? That you go to the right school and you work hard and you'll somehow be elevated. What it does is it pulls up the people who best serve its logic. Like any organism that is intent on self-preservation. And so the people who get elevated to the top are the people who best perform the logic and serve the structure and serve the values of the structure. And so, like, what are the values of the structure? Well, we just look around us, right? It's short-termist, extractionist, life-denying, greedy, psychotic, etc. And so when we understand that, instead of looking at the cover of New York Times or Fortune magazine or what have you, or presidents and prime ministers as people who are somehow learned or achieve it, rather than seeing them as the most psychotic and the most willing to uphold the logic, then this is also part of the ontological shift, right? That as long as we still want what the dominant system is serving on tap, and we want our Wikipedia page, and we want the big title, and we want, like, we are going to be caught in that system. And ontology and structure shape each other. They shape each other at a superstructure level, but they also shape each other in our lives. And then until we do that decolonization work, and it's not this, you know, this is what also comes up when we say things like this, and this often comes up in the degrowth movement, for example. It's like, well, now it's our time to get some. You know, how can you tell us not to do that? And we're not saying that. You know, if that's the place of the life cycle you're in, where accumulation is necessary for social needs or whatever, well, we honor that. And at the same time, you know, to go back to the line that Bayo said, you know, justice will get us a seat at the table, but it'll never let us leave the house of modernity. Recognition, acquisition, power, they might get you a seat at the table, but they're not going to let us leave the house of capitalist modernity. And so the question is, are we trying to dismantle the existing house and create new houses, or are we trying to reform the existing house? And that's also a strategic political, social praxis, life decision that people have to make.
And maybe just to close with that one of when I was invoking the surrender control, part of that is it's a deep inner let go of our preferences for modernity. And this is not a one-off. This is a day by day, moment by moment. How do I sit with the ambiguity, with the not knowing, and not move into a place where I'm then thwarted from any action itself, but continue to be in relationship with life, to be in relationship with my coworker here, to continue to use the gifts that I've been given, but to recognize where I'm preventing some other flow to come in because of I'm gripping to the house of modernity. There's something in what you're speaking to that just brings me back first and foremost into what we are trying to say in this, which is like what we keep invoking of these ontological shifts, that a person who's sitting within this, like how then do I respond to this moment? And I first start with the ontological shifts because I recognize that the seduction of neoliberalism often tries to say problem, solution, and solution at the level of the individual, or solution at the level of the organizational or the broader government structure. And so part of where we're sitting with is not to say, here's a problem, therefore individuals should find the solution, because that again is back to the neoliberal waters that we're swimming in. So I have to start with the question you're asking with this invocation back into what is it about the way that we see? What is it that we, how do we listen? How do we know? This, when we set up that continuums of ontological shifts, we were sitting with what is it for us to practice and live polyculture, many ways of being and knowing, that says that rationality sits alongside of intuition, sits alongside other ways that we could listen. Alnoor and I wrote this book not just through our ideas or what came through, but through a way of really endeavoring to have a praxis of listening to the more than human realm, and to see what, perhaps not through the hubris of our anthropocentric gaze on top of the more than human realm, but could we be humbled and listen and recognize that we are inextricably linked, and from that place listen to then, so how do we be, and how do we respond, and how do we find what is ours to do? When we spoke to this place of ether in the middle, I didn't speak to the role of rites of passage and initiation ceremonies that in a way humble us, our egos, in a way, like humble our very notions of what we see, of how we think what is right, or the energy of I'm certain or I'm righteous, to then invoke what is it to work in and walk in ways that are solidarity with social movements or solidarity with indigenous peoples, or is it for ourselves to find the way that we're participating in the creation of these bioregional infrastructure places, or to actively work with artists to navigate this old cliche that says that we can more imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism. Like, why is that so strong in our collective consciousness? And what is it that we need as communities of praxis to cut through that, to find some sort of collective imaginary that is life-centric? That's where I would begin with your question. And I'm sure my beloved brother would have a lot more to add to that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So one of the things we're also sitting with is because the book is more about more than philanthropy, but it's framed in this way, which is off-putting, right, to many people. And of course, activists who actively have to spend time fundraising will find it useful and are sending it to funders and all of that. But what we're sitting with is maybe we do a version of the book that's more like post-capitalist realities, and make it more, like, simpler, in some ways more accessible. And instead of philanthropy as the part 2, to have a kind of part 2 that does a synthesis of big ag, big tech, big media, big finance, big education, and big philanthropy as one of those sectors, and sort of deconstruct that as it fits into pyramid logic. So yeah, thank you for the question, and we're also like sitting with it, and of course, if people have ideas and thoughts in this circle, in this group, then yeah, always happy to hear them, and you can send info our way. We'll put in, Adam, if you don't mind putting in the info at TRC email into the chat box, and you can be in touch with us there.
And the last piece I would say, Stephen, is when we wrote the book, you saw some of the artwork today that we offered it to others to say, how do you see this? So we could try to have an offering that was ontological shifts. And then throughout the book, we also have a number of different reflection exercises. And it's not just for wealth holders, but it's for all of us to sit with, like, what are the unconscious thought patterns that we have around money and this deity of money? What is it for all of us to sit with how these premises of neoliberalism show up in our lives? And what is it for us to really be students of the dominant culture and find ways that we can open up to other ways of being and knowing? Because we recognize that we're not going to find our way through this through the habituated sense of the problem and solutions, and or through the, as the other question was, through the hero worship, but we're going to find our ways through this probably through coming together in a relational tissue and fabric and listening to what I often say is like the peripheral vision or backspace. What can't we see right in front of us through our orientation, through direct right in front of us of our Occidental, but it's going to be through perhaps the going into the cognitive dissonance that's going to allow us to embrace the crack and the fissure for some sort of other post-capitalist reality to come through.
Mhm. Yeah, and the boundary dissolving states, whether it's Sufi whirling dervish or mantra or tantra or psychedelics or meditation practice or what have you, is like part of what mystical traditions and indigenous traditions have always understood, is that culture can also be calcifying, and to get to these non-ordinary states, what it lets us do is to step outside the culture so we can see how we're situated within it, and that's also a powerful part of the practice. And that ontology is not like a switch, like we can go from rationalist, materialist, separatist worldview that we've been socialized in for 500 plus years, and then move to a more relational, animistic, quantum queer worldview. It requires constant practice, right? It requires me sitting with this table and contemplating it and seeing it as kin again, and asking it questions, and being in wonder and in awe and pondering, and the sort of fast-paced nature of accumulation and consumption within neoliberalism sort of prevents that as well. And so again, like the ontology feeds the structure, and then the structure feeds the ontology, and we have to tend to both.
And maybe because we want to respect the chronos and the kairos time, we can close with perhaps where we close in the book, which is we invoke the myth of Inanna. And Inanna was the goddess of she comes from the Sumerian tradition, and was the goddess of the heaven and the earths. And she does this great descent into the underworld. And one of the earlier artworks spoke to the age of consequences. And as Inanna has to meet with death as an initiation itself, she is brought back from the underworld. She is transformed in the alchemical state through the seeds of earth and the waters of life, and comes up through the queering into this world. And we finish the book with, we are in this age of consequences. We are being brought into this initiatory moment into the underworld. And will we find what it is that is our transformational transition pathway to find our way through? We don't know. The best we can offer right now is to surrender with what the ways that we have been and see and doing that are not serving us, to recognize this threshold, this initiatory moment that we are in as a species, and indeed with all the species on this beautiful earth that we call, and that we may find the courage to walk each other through into the unknown.
It's a good place to stop. Thank you. And thank you to the accompaniment circle, to everyone who asked questions. We'll be back on Jan 13th with our sisters, Dr. Vandana Shiva and Rupa Marya. And it'll be same style of format, 2 hours. They'll be speaking instead of us, and then we'll open it up to conversation.
And we'll figure out how to turn on videos so you all can see each other. And just thank you again for being with us in the lovely embrace of the awkward, and for staying on. So yeah, though we can't see you, we feel you, and just deep gratitude for the collective entanglement and sense making.
Yeah, shukran. See you all soon.